And now to social learning theory. Social learning theory is a bit different than what we've talked about before in that there's not really one person who is primarily associated with the theory. But the main belief in learning theory is that development comes from experience and that children acquire and refine behaviors through their interactions with the environment. And as these experiences accumulate, children develop, and not in stages. So, like I said, there's no one person here, but the most famous person is Albert Bandura. But it really is the accumulation of knowledge over a long period of time. And social learning theory is the way that developmental psychology really got scientific legitimacy. Much prior work, as we've seen through the previous theorists, wasn't really that scientific. Social learning theory is scientifically rigorous, and it does this primarily by advances in bringing children into laboratories and doing real experiments. This also was the most American of theories. We've seen that all of the theorists so far are Europeans whose work came to the United States really well after their primes. Early learning theory, so not social learning theory, but learning theory, was based in classical and operant conditioning, and hopefully you guys remember some of this from intro psych or learning if you've taken it. And this school of thought is really called behaviorism. And we'll get into that in a second and then translate into social learning theory. But before we do that, let's try to put this theory in historical perspective because we've got a decent amount of history of developmental psychology so far. You should have a pretty decent understanding of where we're at. So at this point in time, and even early into the 1900s, much of psychology was about introspection from kind of almost a Freudian sense, where you would think about your thoughts, you'd think about what's in your mind, think about your feelings. And the notion is that this would give some kind of insight into humanity. Well, a man named John Watson came along and declared that psychology should be concerned with predicting and controlling overt behavior, things that you can actually measure. So they are interested not in your internal thoughts and feelings, but instead in your behavior. So in this way, we could objectively measure whatever the psychological phenomena were and develop a true science. And one thing that I kind of passed over briefly was the goal really was to predict and control behavior. Watson actually said this, quote, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." End quote. This is big talk. I remember talking to somebody who was not by name a behaviorist because they weren't even a psychologist, but they had a similar line of thinking here, which was that the only reason anybody becomes anything is because of the environment that they are brought up in. And I pushed this to an extreme, and I said, does this mean that if you were to have taken my brain and transplanted it into Albert Einstein's body at birth, that my brain would have come up with a theory of relativity? And she said yes. To which I said, well, thank you. Thank you very much. But really, I mean, I think that is way, way too extreme. So behaviorism and I don't get along that well at the extremes, but there are definitely some things we can take from this. Learning theorists had a reductionist approach. they wanted to break down behavior into simple units, study the smaller units, and then put the actions, the larger actions, back together as chunks of these smaller units. This is one thing I really do think is good from social learning theory. They said that the simplest units are associations between stimulus and response. That there is something that is a stimulus and that elicits a response in the person. Learning theorists were interested in these associations and looked for ways to strengthen, weaken, and link them to other associations. The two types of learning were broken down into classical and operant conditioning. And I know you guys really should know this from intro psych, but we'll briefly go over it. So classical conditioning is where there is some kind of reflex that is paired with another stimulus that elicits a reaction that becomes learned. Pavlov's dog, for example. The most famous classical conditioning experiment in developmental psychology was Watson's Little Albert, and some of you might have heard of this before. He conditioned fear in an 11-month-old child, Little Albert. He placed a white rat in front of him, and when the child reached for it, they struck a steel bar behind him with a hammer, which produced a painful sound. And little Albert started crying from this. So the reflexive behavior is the crying when there is this painful sound. And after pairing this painful sound with the rat, the child started to fear the rat when it was alone without any sound. And this response generalized to other stimuli, including rabbits, fur coats, a Santa Claus mask. And unfortunately, his mother took him out of the study, understandably, but she didn't allow Watson to first uncondition him. So we don't really know what happened. There's some reports, but theoretically, he could have been walking around being fearful of white furry things for a long time. Now, one of Watson's students, Mary Covert Jones, helped eliminate fear in a 2-year-old by providing the child with a snack as a white rabbit was brought closer and closer and closer. And when this positive stimulus was present, the snack, the rabbit wasn't enough fear to overcome it, and eventually the child was back to petting the rabbit. And this is one of the main points of contention between Freud and behaviorism. Anybody see this? Well, Freud was interested in deep-seated fears and why they were there and what it meant about you. But behaviorists just wanted to address the fears and get rid of them. They didn't care why they came out, really. And one thing to note before we move on, we've already mentioned a woman for the first time, and also for all of the concerns I have about Watson, he did say in his quote that he could make anybody anything regardless of something, including the race of his ancestors. So this is already more egalitarian in many ways than the other theories we've seen, but it also is a little bit later on. But nonetheless, it was something to note minimally. Watson was also famous for his other interesting parenting ideas, and I'll just read you a quote from him. "There is a sensible way of treating children. Treat them as though they were young adults. Dress them, bathe them with care and circumspection. Let your behavior always be objective and kindly firm. Never hug and kiss them, never let them sit in your lap. If you must, kiss them once on the forehead when they say good night. Shake hands with them in the morning. Give them a pat on the head if they have made an extraordinarily good job of a difficult task. Try it out. In a week's time, you will find how easy it is to be perfectly objective with your child and, at the same time, kindly. You will be utterly ashamed of the mawkish, sentimental way you have been handling it. End quote. It might not surprise you to learn that John Watson left psychology for advertising in 1920. So, classical conditioning. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, revolves around shaping people's behavior through rewards and punishments. The positive and negative punishment and rewards. Experimenters can take behaviors that children or animals, people, do naturally, and eventually, by giving rewards and punishments, they can elicit the desired behavior. You probably remember the research showing how rats run mazes quicker in certain situations. Pigeons can press buttons and appear like they could even read. Children can act well. One of the main people in this was B.F. Skinner, Skinner. He was a bit extreme, as you'll see for most of these learning theory people. He said that in a utopian society, children would be raised by behavioral engineers who are specialists in operant conditioning. Children would have self-control and independence fostered by reinforcement, where poor work habits and jealousy would be extinguished by a lack of reinforcement. In the 60s, researchers found that infants and children could even be shaped, and social reinforcers such as attention, smiles, and praise were particularly potent reinforcers for children. Now, people became relatively quickly aware that children are more than rats. And we know that this is too simplistic, but not much too simplistic. They also saw that children used language and other cognitive tools to learn things, so learning seemed to be cognitive as well. And these learning theorists also became more interested in things like language, attention, memory, things like that. And some people also realized that biological predispositions limited the laws of learning. So you can't get anyone to do anything. There are some people who are not going to be able to be doctors or lawyers or whatever, in contrast to what Watson had said. So while the theory didn't survive in developmental psychology long term, it was really useful, and primarily in the scientific rigor and the movement to the laboratory. And this is something that you should remember. So, social learning theory really started in the 1930s with a guy named Clark Hull. He took popular concepts at the time, Freudian concepts like dependency, aggression, identification, defense mechanisms, but he looked to find behaviorist ways of examining them. He said, quote, "The ultimate goal is to combine the vitality of psychoanalysis, the rigor of the natural science laboratory, and the facts of culture." End quote. So he brought parts of Freud that could be tested empirically, and he ditched the rest of it. And by taking interesting and important things and integrating learning principles, it became a much more plausible scientific discipline. Of particular interest for us was a shift to examine imitation. Now, imitation is interesting because children seem to naturally do it. But at the same time, he said that they thought children would imitate behavior because imitated behavior is reinforced. So when a child does something that a parent does for the first time when they're young, what do parents do? Well, they usually clap or cheer. And this led to a new look at Freud's theory of identification. So the question became, is it that children wanted to be like their parents for these odd Freudian reasons? Or could it be that they are reinforced? That if a little boy acts in a masculine way, could they be reinforced by mother and father, and therefore learn that that's what they are supposed to do? So adults could prefer boys like fathers and girls who are like their mothers, and they could reinforce them through this. Bandura took the idea of modeling further to see if even new behaviors could be acquired simply by watching a model who was reinforced. So, children who see a hardworking classmate who's praised might try that behavior. Or if bad children get away with something, they might try it themselves. Because if you think about it, if a child acts in a bad way and nothing bad happens, they probably are getting something from that. They get to hit a kid, they get to take a cookie, they get to whatever. So they get the reward without any punishment. He called this viewing of other people vicarious reinforcement. And this is a particular advance because operant conditioning can explain new behaviors by shaping, but they can't explain how a behavior arises after simply watching a child. Because there's not a reward or punishment to the child who is watching, there's a reward or punishment to the other child. So it adds in this cognitive component that wasn't there previously. So Bandura took learning theory and broadened it to sex typing, aggression, all kinds of other behaviors that helped social cognitive learning theory survive past simple learning theory in developmental psychology. So let's talk more about observational learning. Both social learning theory and sociocultural theories focus on the environment and non-biological influences on behavior, right? And they also reinforce the importance of learning from the environment. However, social learning theory differs in that it looks at children as individuals, as opposed to Vygotsky. And they wanted to look at children's own perceptions of their abilities and the environment, which really is in some ways more about themselves than other people. Observational learning was particularly important for developmental psychology because most children don't learn in the classically behaviorist sense. They don't end up in overt trial and error stimulus response learning. And instead, they watch people and they repeat actions. There are actually some estimates that toddlers learn an average of 1 to 2 behaviors a day simply by observing and repeating actions. And this is even though they might not demonstrate what they've learned until sometime later. So if you do a trick with a pen, you don't see a kid doing it, and then some random several days later they might do it. Well, they still learned that a couple days ago. Observational learning is also good for explaining how new and complex behaviors are acquired, and in cases where mistakes are life-threatening. You cannot, well, you could, but we do not want people to learn through experience how not to jump off a cliff. We can't reinforce them or punish them by when they jump off a cliff following it. So let's take learning baseball as an example. There are many complex cognitive and perceptual motor skills involved. It is doubtful that kids could learn to pitch just by you telling them. Say, okay, you stand with your feet close together, standing forward. You move if you're right-handed, you move your left leg back and to your left, and you lean back, and then you lean forward, and it's complicated. So much of learning how to pitch and other things comes from watching other children do that activity or play. And in particular, older children, parents, coaches, professionals, and they are more likely to be imitated because they are perceived to be of high status. I know that when I was younger, I was in 6th grade in 1998. And that was when the Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwire thing was going on, and I changed my batting stance to look more like Sammy Sosa because I liked him so much. I was imitating him because he was one of the best. we can forget about the steroids for a little while. So children learn a lot through what Bandura called abstract modeling. And this abstract modeling is where you abstract a general rule from observing specific behaviors. So you get a general rule of how to do something or what something is from simply observing behaviors. And they'll gradually get general concepts of the game. So in terms of baseball, pitching strategy, predicting how people will act, differences between first and third baseman, just noticing that shortstops and second basemen tend to be smaller than first basemen, things like that. And then children then try to reproduce behaviors they have seen and receive feedback about how closely they have matched it. And here we can see learning theory's influence. Coaches say good job, teammates are happy with you, you get certain other kinds of feedback when you make an error, etc., etc. So reinforcement serves as the primary way children learn when their actions are adequate. So if you have 2 children and one child really enjoys reading books and the other one really enjoys running around, does it necessarily mean that these 2 children are different in their biological predispositions? Well, not necessarily. It could be that one child is really reinforced for reading, and they learn to internalize it and the value of reading, whereas the other one might not. Maybe they are more reinforced for running around and doing physical activities, behaviors, etc. This is one area, just as a heads up, we can see potential gender influences here and sex typing. The most classical example of observational learning is the Bobo doll experiment. And this slide shows a picture of the Bobo doll experiment from early on, as you can tell by the quality of the photos and the outfits they have on. So in this experiment, children would see an aggressive model punch a large inflated doll, as you can see on the top row on the slide. So it's the kind of doll that is weighted at the bottom and you hit it, and if you hit it at the top, the bottom will stay where it is, but it'll fall backwards and it'll pop right back up. So it's this inflated doll. So you see an adult, or a model, in this case this woman in the skirt, punching, hitting, kicking this doll, sometimes hitting it in the head with a hammer, and actually said things like, sock him in the nose, and pow. And then a second group of children would see a model play non-aggressively with Tinker Toys. And then there was a third control group that had no model at all. And later, children were allowed to play in a room with a variety of aggressive toys, like Bobo dolls, the dart guns, a ball with a face on it, and also non-aggressive toys like teddy bears and trucks, as well as items that the model used. Children who had seen the aggressive model were more aggressive than the other 2 groups. And this shouldn't be surprising to us. Now, there are 2 options for why this happened. Either, number 1, they learned new forms of aggression. So they could have seen this woman in the case on the screen do something they hadn't seen before, and they learned that. Or they could have, the second option is, they could have observed aggression, and that could have disinhibited previously inhibited aggressive desires, meaning that they were shown that it was okay to do things that they might have been interested in doing previously. Now, there was the support for both of them, but the new forms of aggression that they saw, that's not quite as interesting as a second one that gets to almost more Freudian notions. Now, the support for the disinhibition comes from the fact that children also used aggressive behavior that was different than what the model used. Meaning that instead of if the model kicks the doll, they might have done a running, jumping kick. They might have kicked it with both feet at the same time. They might have done all of these kinds of different things. So it wasn't strictly learning what the model was doing. They seemed to come up with their own new, unique ways to be aggressive. This study was of interest because it elevated the question of whether watching violence on TV and movies would increase aggression. Now, what's the saying? Everything old is new again. We still have these questions today. We will get much more into this when we talk about the media later in the semester. But it was questioned if they were expressing or becoming more aggressive, or if they were just playing in a way that seemed to be approved by adults because they saw a model. It's also interesting that that Freud and Bandura would give opposite predictions of the effects of watching aggression. So Freud would say that if you watched aggression on TV or something, that it would actually reduce aggressive tensions and lead to less aggression later. Because while we would like to be aggressive, we can let the steam out. The ego can come in and say, hey, you're allowed partial relief of this tension by just viewing it. Whereas Bandura predicted that it would lead to more aggression, especially if the aggression wasn't punished. And it turns out Bandura was right. I know it's always going to be shocking when I tell you that Freud's wrong, but meh. Additionally interesting was the finding that while boys were more aggressive than girls, girls learned as much aggression as boys. Meaning that girls, if they were asked, could produce aggressive behaviors when they were asked and rewarded for doing so. But they typically didn't produce as much aggression. And the implication here is that even if people don't immediately produce violent behavior, they might still have learned it. So if parents say, I let my kids watch violence on TV, and they aren't violent right after watching it, this might be a bit short-sighted, because yes, they might not have been violent immediately following it, but they still could have learned from it. And this also helped move in other areas. So people later found that kids who watched more smoking in movies were about 3 times more likely to start or to try smoking themselves. So it goes kind of across the board. All right, so how does this happen? What is the mechanism for development? Well, really what they're doing, they're focusing on the processes of change like Vygotsky. Now, Freud and Piaget were more interested in structural changes. Bandura said that change occurs in 3 factors: physical maturation, experience with the social world, and cognitive development. Now, this is not groundbreaking. That's kind of biology, social experience, cognitive development. That's kind of all there is in the world. Now, physical maturation was not particularly relevant for social learning theory. They were not biologists. They're not pediatricians, so they're not too concerned with that. But the main way that it is important is that it's a prerequisite for other aspects of development, just like other theorists would say, including Piaget, for example. Now, experience with the social world, what does that do? Well, it allows for an interaction with other people where children can acquire behaviors, they can learn appropriate behaviors, they can learn appropriate situations for those behaviors, and since they are reinforced, they later become motivated to perform them. And over time, they get more and more behaviors through more and more models in TV, school, family, etc. Cognitive development was important because how children's conceptions of the world And in many social learning theorists, self-efficacy is particularly important. These are formed by direct experience of the effects produced by actions. And I said self-efficacy is important. Well, self-efficacy is people's perceptions of their competence in dealing with their environment and exercising influence over events that affect their lives. So people's perceptions of their competence in dealing with their environment and exercising influence over events that affect their lives. It also could be beliefs in one's capabilities to recognize and execute the course of action required to produce given attainments. Basically, it's like being the little engine that could. The reason Bandura thought this was so important is that self-efficacy affects all kinds of behaviors: school, play, everything. It's actually been found that believing that you have an ability to cause change can influence things like academic performance. You can look at high and low performers, and the children with high self-efficacy solve more problems, reject strategies that don't work sooner, and are more willing to rework problems because they believe that they can bring about change. A positive reaction to adversity shows that they think they can do better if they try harder. It's not out of their control. Therefore, persisting in the face of rejection is something self-efficacy is necessary for. And they gave some examples. James Joyce's The Dubliners was rejected by 22 publishers. Gertrude Stein submitted poems to editors for 20 years before finally being accepted. Fred Astaire was rejected as a balding, skinny actor who can dance a little bit by Hollywood at first. The Beatles were rejected prior to receiving a contract, and Disneyland was rejected at first because it would only attract riffraff, quote unquote. For those of you who are not old enough to know these people or just simply do not know them, another example would be with the Harry Potter author, what's her name, J.K. Rowling, that her books were rejected many times before they were accepted. And self-efficacy is developed by children over time in many ways, and the family is particularly important, as its parents self-efficacy about their parenting skills. And this is a pretty good summary of social learning theory. So let's move on to the developmental issues. Human nature. Learning theory is very mechanistic. Children are to be fashioned by parents and society. So old school learning theory, children kind of are plugged in almost to an equation. Stimulus, response, you punish them, reward them in the proper ways, they'll act in certain ways. So very mechanistic. However, this is not true for modern social learning theory. Instead, they are much more organismic, like Piaget. So self-organizing, proactive, self-reflective, and self-regulating. So today, they are organismic. In terms of qualitative and quantitative development, it's qualitative in that people are learning more and more. Quantitative. I'm going to mess that up all the time. Quantitative in that people are learning more and more over time. And also it's not qualitative because there are no real stages or huge kind of cognitive reorganizations like Piaget would have. In terms of the nature-nurture discussion, they're more interested in nature. However, we did see that they did give biology much more, social learning theory at least, gave biology much more lip service than traditional learning theorists. Traditional learning theorists really didn't care about biology. Social learning theory, and today they certainly acknowledge, even if that is not their primary interest, that biology is important. What develops? Well, it really depends on your environment and your culture. So Freud, Piaget, and Vygotsky all said they were universals that people had. Piaget had stages. Vygotsky and Freud had their sexual and aggressive impulses. Nothing is like that for social learning theory. There's no real thing that is universal, or stages, or these impulses. It really is just mechanisms that develop with no particular end goal. You're developing because that's what humans do, and you're learning over time based on what is culturally relevant to you, what you are reinforced and punished for, what you observe. And lastly, the strengths and weaknesses. Well, one strength is the focus on the situation. Other developmentalists are more concerned with behavior that is constant across time and across situations. And this makes sense in a way because in their mind that is really who you are. But social learning theory shows that behavior changes in different situations depending on models, reinforcement and punishments, a person's experience, all of these kinds of things. So both of these are true, that people are as they are in certain situations, across situations, and that it depends on the situation. But social learning theory provides a little bit better balance. So if a child is aggressive at home but not school, which situation better describes the child? Are they aggressive or are they not? So according to social learning theory, both of these are necessary to inform us of what is really happening with a child. You can't get an accurate snapshot of a child by just looking at them in one place at one time. The second big plus we've already talked about was in testability. Learning theory sucks in many ways, to me at least, but it is really testable, and that's great. So for all of the crap that Freud is given for his lack of testability, behaviorists and social learning theorists really should be given credit. Now, what are some weaknesses? Well, first, there's no real consideration of cognitive development in a meaningful way. So you can't say how exactly the cognitive level of one age influences behavior in a given situation. There's no real understanding of that. But more to the point, there's actually a question as to whether or not social learning theory is a truly developmental theory. In their mind, development occurs when there is an accumulation of experience. But is development just short-term changes that are accumulated over time? If so, it's just measuring something at different points in time, experimentally, as opposed to having a truly developmental theory. Now, this is one place where I do kind of agree with learning theorists, that you don't necessarily have to have a theory. Maybe the theory will come later, but we can get into that later. And then finally, the description of natural settings. We know from social learning theory that variables can affect learning and social behaviors more than what variables actually operate in the lives of children. So we know children can imitate, utilize abstract modeling, reinforcement, but which of these are important in natural settings and at different ages? So there are some questions that this brings up, but it is definitely a good thing that they addressed it in much more detail than some others did.